Well, good morning, everyone. I think we should just get started. Welcome to our webinar this morning on some practical legal issues arising from the current lockdown. And we're very grateful to the Edinburgh Chamber for inviting us to speak today. Give you a word of introduction. My name is Douglas Blythe. I'm a partner in the dispute resolution team in Dentons. And as you can imagine, as part of the world's largest law firm, we've had our fair share of COVID-19 related queries over the last few weeks. And we've amassed a lot of resources as a result of these queries, which are organised by country and subject matter. And these can all be accessed on our COVID-19 hub on our website. And I'll give you some details of how to access that at the end of today's seminar. In the meantime, we've got 4 speakers lined up for you this morning. They are Fiona Caldo, who's going to speak to you on some of the issues to do with signing a contract remotely during a lockdown. Mark Hamilton, who's going to speak to you about some practical employment issues. Malcolm Gullion, who's going to speak to you about health and safety duties to employees during lockdown. And finally, Craig Kennedy, who's going to talk about the ever-present cyber threat and some proactive resilience during a lockdown. We're aiming, we're down for an hour today, but we're aiming to keep the talks to 10 minutes each, leaving us roughly 20 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. And if questions do occur to you as we go along, if we can keep the questions to the end, but please feel free to add the questions into the chat function, and then Rebecca and I can pick these up during the Q&A session. Alternatively, you'll have an opportunity to be able to raise questions verbally during the Q&A at the end. And I'll explain how to do that when we get there. But for now, please sit back, relax, and I'll pass you to our first speaker this morning, Fiona Caldo. Fiona is a practice development lawyer within our disputes team and has a focus on knowledge management, innovation and training, and a particular interest in commercial contract law. She's received literally bags of inquiries recently about how to sign documents in a lockdown, so is very well placed to give us a summary of some of the key points arising. And without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Fiona.
Thank you, Douglas. Good morning, everyone. Yes, we certainly know from the volume of queries that we have been receiving that signing contracts in lockdown is an issue that a lot of you are currently contending with. So if we can turn to the first slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so what's currently happening are folks still putting pen to paper, or is that being replaced with electronic signing solutions? Well, the answer is a bit of both. We are seeing a continuation of wet ink signing, which does remain necessary for certain types of transactions. But we're also seeing quite a rapid increase in the use of electronic signing platforms, and I'll come on to speak about them in a little bit of detail. If we can move to the next slide. Thank you. We'll talk through each of the options for signing in lockdown, and the first of those is the traditional approach, wet ink round robin signings. And I mention that because in most cases it is still possible for each party to a contract to sign in the traditional way if timescales permit. Now, while parties can no longer gather for a completion meeting, contracts can and are still being posted from house to house or couriered from house to house to be signed in the traditional way. That can be quite clunky. It can also be costly if we're relying on couriers for parties who are not geographically close. And it can take time, and perhaps sometimes more time than parties have available to them. Now, the second option, which is in the slide here, allows us to simplify and speed up the signing process. And that is having a sort of virtual completion, still using wet ink documents by signing and counterpart. And signing a counterpart is an option that's been around in Scotland for about 5 years now. It involves each party signing their own copy of the contract and then taking steps to deliver their signed copy of the contract, or at least the signed signature pages. And delivery can be carried out electronically by parties scanning their version of the signed contract, or scanning at least the signature page and emailing it to the other parties to the contract. From a practical perspective, that still requires a bit of kit. It requires access to a printer, because we're still talking about wet ink signing, putting pen to paper. It requires scanning facilities, although there is potential at least to substitute a well-taken, good quality photograph of the signed page and emailing it to the other parties to a transaction. And of course, it requires access to email to attach and send on the document. But a useful approach that is currently being used quite a bit. If we turn to the next slide. And electronic signature, of course, allows us to speed up the process yet further. An electronic signature is competent and is useful really in quite a number of types of transaction. And what we're talking about with electronic signature is doing away with pen and paper entirely. Electronic signature takes quite a number of different forms. So the little pads, for example, that delivery drivers have when you get your Amazon or Tesco delivery, where you mark your initials or signature on the screen, those pads create an electronic signature. But the type of electronic signature I'd like to focus on here is electronic signature applied by an electronic signature provider. And that is a platform which lets you upload a document to a secure cloud-based environment and make it available for other parties to sign. And the most well-known providers in the market are DocuSign and Adobe Sign, but there are other similar platforms. Now, just to talk you through that process for anybody who's not already used, it, it involves one party who has a license to use the platform, uploading the document that they would like to have signed to the platform, and then tagging it to mark up who should be signing the contract and where. And they also provide the email addresses of the parties that will be signing it. Those signing will receive an email containing a link to the document. They can access the document via that link, and when they access it, the document will be marked up to show them where they have to apply their signature. And their signature can easily be applied using mouse movements on a laptop or desktop computer, or by using their finger or any other tool on an iPad screen or on a mobile phone screen. So it's a really simple and user-friendly process and requires no kit other than a mobile phone. And in terms of the evidential status, what we have is the platform itself capturing key information at the point of signature. So the platform will capture the email address and the IP address from which the document has been accessed, and it will also record the date and time of signature and store this information in some sort of certificate of completion. With electronic signature, what you have is all parties signing the same electronic document. That electronic document is the principal agreement, and it exists in electronic form, although it will usually be circulated in read-only PDF format. And that's a point that sometimes causes a little confusion. There's no need, for example, to create a wet ink signed principal at the end of lockdown. In fact, that would cause confusion as to what the principal document is. The document simply exists in its electronic form. Now, there are 3 tiers of electronic signature which are recognised by law, and these are simple electronic signature, advanced electronic signature, and qualified electronic signature. And these 3 tiers refer to the extent to which the platform provider verifies the identity of the party signing the agreement, with qualified electronic signature being the most secure. Now, other than smart cards, which have been issued by the Law Society of Scotland to solicitors in Scotland in a scheme that's not had a high level of uptake, well, other than those smart cards, there are not readily available providers of advanced electronic signature or qualified electronic signature to commercial parties in the UK market. And those three tiers and the lack of availability is important to understand, because it gives rise to constraints on the use of electronic signature in Scotland. And there's three main constraints as outlined on the slide. The first is that documents that the law requires to be in writing, so for example, the main one really is documents transferring interest in land. So for the documents for the sale of purchase or of land or lease agreements, these require to be in writing as a matter of law. And where a document requires to be in writing, an advanced electronic signature or a qualified electronic signature is required. Another example is wills. Because advanced electronic signatures and qualified electronic signatures are not readily available, in practice this means that documents that require to be in writing cannot be signed electronically in the UK at present. A second relevant factor is the practice of signing documents in a manner to give them an enhanced evidential status, which is known as self-proving status. Now, contracts which are of higher value or of greater commercial significance are usually signed this way in Scotland. And when we're signing in wet ink, that's achieved by a business signing through two authorised signatories rather than one, or when an individual is signing by an individual having their signature witnessed. Signing in this way gives the document a greater evidential status, in that it makes the authenticity of the document harder to challenge in the event that its terms require to be enforced through litigation. Now, the key point here is that documents in Scotland can only be signed in a self-proving manner using a qualified electronic signature. And again, because that's not readily available, it is necessary to revert to pen to paper, wet ink signature for these types of more important transactions where self-proving status is sought. Final constraint relates to filing requirements. Now, some government registers, such as the Land Registry of Scotland, do not accept electronic signatures. So if a document needs to be registered, then you may not be able to sign it electronically. So it's important to check first and have a think through what's going to happen to the document once it has been signed, and whether there's any constraints in that regard. So just to summarise, electronic signatures can be very convenient and very useful, particularly for more routine business. But old school, putting pen to paper does still have a role to play currently. Sometimes that's through personal preference, and sometimes that's due to necessity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That was a very, very helpful, and another example of how we're still lagging a wee bit behind, I think, in terms of being able to fully function in a remote environment. But I suppose one thing we are seeing brought about by this forced lockdown is really an unprecedented speed of change, with a lot of people reacting and finding ways around. And I think that the law will be an example of that. And I think we would all expect to see AES and QES become more widely available in due course. If we can now pass on to Mark Hamilton, who's going to speak to us about some practical employment issues. Mark is a partner in our People, Reward and Mobility team, specialising obviously in employment law. He's based in our Edinburgh office and advises on employment-related issues throughout the UK. He acts for clients in a wide variety of sectors, from food and drink to financial services, and from energy to retail, and just about everything in between. So Mark, if we can pass on to you, please, to give us some insights into some of the practical employment issues.
Hopefully you can all hear me. Good morning. The lockdown has, of course, made many of us remote workers, perhaps in a way which we never expected or even wanted to become. But remote working isn't new. Many people throughout the UK and wider fields have been working remotely for a long time. So it does raise issues, and certainly the scale of remote working over the last few weeks has raised a number of issues. But all of those issues are ones which at least some businesses are tolerably familiar with, and what is different is the sheer magnitude of the way these issues arise in the context of the lockdown. But it's important to remember that, as I say, some people are remote workers as a normal part of their arrangement. It's for life for them, not just for pandemics. And the fundamentals of employment law apply to remote workers just as they apply to people who work in a regular workplace. So unfair dismissal protection, discrimination, redundancy, part-time or fixed-term prevention of less favorable treatment, all those things continue to apply, whether it's long-term remote working or during a lockdown. Those rules apply to all employees as they always have done. What is important, though, is to make sure that your both the formal aspects of your employment relationship, so your contracts, your policies, and the less tangible but equally important interpersonal aspects of that relationship are adapted to cover a lockdown or long-term remote working, whichever is arise. And I think we all know that even if lockdown as such ends in a few weeks' time, it is likely that many people will be working remotely considerably after the end of that long lockdown period. So this is not just about the next few weeks. These things become, the contracts, the relationships become ever more important, where you can't rely on regular face-to-face meetings, which can help to resolve so many issues within a traditional workplace. So getting those contracts and policies, etc., right is important. And what I'm talking about today is just a few of the areas which are perhaps particularly significant in the remote working lockdown scenario. So if we could turn to the next slide, please. That's it, thank you. The first of these is maintaining confidentiality. Now, we all know that the average work stream during the course of your day, you're looking at a lot of information, much of which will be confidential. That may be coming through your IT systems, there may still be physical documents, and there'll certainly be lots of calls made where confidential information is discussed. In an office, surrounded by other people who are also employed by the organization, who are also hopefully subject to express contracts of employment which say that they have duties of confidentiality to the organization, there is a degree of physical security around those discussions and those documents. That extra level of security doesn't exist in the remote working scenario. So you have to ask yourselves, who has access to the remote worker's desk? Who sits beside them when they are making calls, listening to those calls perhaps? Who can see their papers if they're left on the desk, or are they put away in a secure filing cabinet? What policies do you have to make sure there's protection in place there? Does the remote worker share their workspace with a partner or housemate? And what do they do if the plumber comes in and happens to try to fix something beside where they're working? Those people do not owe duties of confidentiality to the organization. And it's bad enough if your commercially sensitive information is revealed, but lots of us deal with personal data, and we've all seen what happens to your reputation and the consequences of fines where personal data is not protected properly and is disclosed publicly. Something definitely to be avoided. So your policies need to be clear and backed up by the disciplinary policy in relation to confidential information. That might include checking the working environment of the remote worker, requiring that worker to tell you if they change their environment, if they go and take a shared office somewhere, or even perhaps to tell you if their partner or housemates gets a job with a competitor. But you need to be clear from the beginning what your expectations are. Remote working also makes it more difficult, or certainly not impossible, but more difficult to mentor and assess people. Many employers have been putting appraisal processes on hold through the process of the lockdown. But the longer this goes on, the less tenable that will be. So we'll have to find ways of making these things work. And they can be made to work, but it does require more planning and more effort. So Mentoring in particular is perhaps more difficult, and this is ever more so where you're dealing with new recruits. For an existing team who before the lockdown worked together, there will be relationships already in place which will help take us through the few months, whatever it is, we are working remotely. But for a new recruit, how does that person get integrated into the team? How do they get trained properly? You can do some of that remotely, but they can't pick up the skills from the other people in the team as in the same way that they could. So you need to make sure you've got policies and processes which help that. And that takes us on to team engagement. Morale is a critical issue. Integrating new people also, how do you get them to engage with the team? Remote working, as I say, makes this just a little bit more difficult. Absolutely not impossible, but you do want to maintain collegiality. Distance, as I say, makes the heart wander, and that is equally true in the employment context. So there are lots of tools available. Many of us will have been using Zoom and WhatsApp to keep teams together since the lockdown started, even though probably some of us had never heard of these things prior to 23rd of March, and certainly never thought about using them in a business context. But those tools are just tools. It's what you do with them that counts. So you need to make sure that managers are aware of how best to use these to integrate their team and keep people engaged. Malcolm will be talking shortly about health and safety in particular and employers' duties in the lockdown. But it is very important to make sure as part of your engagement that people do recognize they have to separate work life and home life. Many people have found over the last few weeks, so that's quite a difficult distinction to draw. And that can lead to stress, fatigue, and loss of productivity, and increase in the wrong sort of turnover, that staff turnover. So definitely team engagement is something to be focused on with the remote worker. If we could turn to the next slide, please. Thank you. Unfortunately, even during lockdowns and with remote working, discipline and grievance procedures remain critically important. It isn't as easy to hold investigations when there's a lockdown in place. But all the normal rules of discipline and grievance processes have to apply. But they have to be practical when people are separated by distance and can't actually get together. And it's important to remember that simply being separated from other employees does not mean a worker is protected from discrimination or harassment. Being bullied can happen at a distance. Indeed, one of the most common forms of bullying, which you see in tribunals, is exclusion. And how much easier is it to exclude someone from the team, from work, if they are at a distance? So you need to be particularly aware of these potential issues. And that means you want to make absolutely certain that remote workers, be it during a lockdown or otherwise, know how to raise concerns and have the confidence to raise those concerns internally before they become a major problem, perhaps after they've left and start to raise tribunal complaints. If it's dealt with internally, you can deal with it in time, hopefully, to prevent that problem becoming more significant. Remote workers do not, by and large, have a trusted colleague sitting beside them who they can confide in and get advice and perhaps help put things into perspective, which makes your policies, as I say, on grievances and on whistleblowing in particular, ever more important. And also in disciplinary situations, you'll know, I suspect many of you, that any employee has the right to be accompanied in a disciplinary process. But how do you do that in remote working? And if somebody has always worked remotely, they may not have a trusted fellow employee who they want to accompany them. The tribunal will expect an employer to be reasonable. And in that sense, even though an employee doesn't have a statutory right to have a family member present, for example, at a disciplinary or a grievance meeting, a tribunal may say, under the current circumstances, it was reasonable for the employer to adapt the process and allow that employee to have a family member present to help them through the process. So you do need to think about these things and be flexible in the way you approach them. And then finally, on just how remote. Most of the time we're dealing with people who are remote within the same country, therefore subject to the same rules. But a remote worker could be just down the road or on the other side of the globe. And if that's the case, it's vitally important to remember that just because the process, you're connected virtually, let's get rid of that noise, the process comes connected virtually, it doesn't mean to say that that distance is unimportant. The more remote they are, the more that you need to be aware that the rules, the employment law rules, the tax regimes that apply to that work may be different. Even if you think of in the UK, Northern Ireland, there are different rules in Northern Ireland. The rules in England are slightly, not very much, but slightly different in certain regards. You need to be aware of those distinctions. And just because you don't have an office or operation in the country where the remote worker is, doesn't mean to say that that worker can't sue you in their home courts. Many countries, perhaps even most countries, allow employees to sue their employer in the country in which they work, regardless of where the employer is. That's a default position within Europe, for example. And while many countries do have broadly similar levels of protection, there are a lot of differences. And even where there are similarities, the devil is inevitably in the detail. The one rule which I would say is pretty common is that ignorance of the law is no defense. So it won't help you as the employer to be able to say, well, I didn't realize the rules were different in that just jurisdiction. You need to be aware what those rules are. And just as a fairly blatant plug, I suppose, I say it's both a local and a global firm. The Dentons team in Edinburgh and in Scotland, we have the contacts throughout the world, so we can get you advice, practical advice from around the world if you have remote workers in other jurisdictions, whether during the lockdown or for longer term. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I think the point you make about the current environment not being a short-term thing, I think is a very good one. I think there's perhaps a tendency for people to assume that we'll come to the end of the current lockdown period and everybody will be back at the desks and back into Costa or whatever is your favourite coffee provider as per usual. And of course, it isn't going to be that way. We are going to see remote working being a fact of life for a very long time to come, I think. So obviously starting to look at these kind of policies, procedures, etc., sooner rather than later is vitally important. One of the great challenges of remote working, I'm just discovering, is I've just been advised that my daughter has a bagpipe lesson at 10:30, which is terrific timing, but hopefully sound installation is adequate. Without any further ado, we'll pass on now to Malcolm Gunnion, to talk about some of the health and safety duties to employees during lockdown. Malcolm's a partner based in our Aberdeen office and leads our Scottish health and safety practice. He's got a broad range of experience in health and safety prosecutions and fatal accident inquiries, and with particular expertise in the energy, transport and food and drink sectors. So Malcolm, if I can pass over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Douglas. I'll give you a call after this about the health and safety risks of proximity to bagpipes, and we can give you some advice on that. Everyone, you'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to try and give you advice today on how to deal with coronavirus or what the protocols are around dealing with COVID-19 protections and prevention measures in the workplace or indeed in public spaces. That's well beyond my capabilities as a lawyer. So what I'm keen to talk about are some of the business as usual aspects of health and safety that will continue to apply, that there'll still be duties on employers, but that we might run the risk of forgetting or perhaps letting slide whilst we are focusing on bigger safety issues like coronavirus protection and social distancing. So we can jump to the first slide, please, that'd be great. So as point one says there, our health and safety obligations and duties as employers are not going to disappear during lockdown. As most of you will know, two main arms of duties under the health and safety at work legislation. Section 2 duties to our employees and Section 3 duties to members of the public, and they'll all remain in place. Many are going to become more difficult to fulfill. There are simply practical challenges in dealing with safety issues and health issues for employees who are working remotely. As you'll know, the general test in all health and safety legislation is that an employer must do all that is reasonably practicable. So inevitably, there is going to be an argument that certain things simply weren't practical during lockdown. And I suspect that the HSE will in some cases accept that as a response. But make no mistake, it was simply too difficult during lockdown defence is not going to apply to the vast majority of health and safety duties. So we need to make sure, as all of us as employers, that we're looking at our business as usual processes, and we're making sure that we're changing those processes to accommodate the current difficulties. I guess there are two separate strands of issues that will face employers: those who have still got operations in their premises, and then those who like Dentons, have the vast majority of our teams working from home. For those that are still operating, clearly there are issues around social distancing and cleanliness measures, sanitation. But perhaps an issue that might fall by the wayside is, how do employers with less numbers of staff on the premises, perhaps some furloughed staff, how do you continue to fulfill your obligations of monitoring and auditing performance on the factory floor? And that, I think, is something that we all have to be very careful of. One of the main reasons for a prosecution in Scotland is that policies and procedures haven't been followed, and management haven't known that those weren't being followed on the shop floor. That's an issue during any working environment, particularly an issue during lockdown, when new processes have had to be put in place pretty quickly around social distancing measures, for example, in food production facilities. But there are less management perhaps working on site, they're working from home. How do you ensure, and you need to have a system in place for ensuring, that there is still a way for compliance to be audited, for safety checks to be undertaken, for site walkthroughs, safety inspections to be done? So that, I think, if you're still operating in your premises, that's something to be acutely aware of, and that's something that the HSE, if there is an incident, they will come in and look at. To what extent was there continued monitoring of what was happening, both in terms of your BAU policies and also in terms of your coronavirus policies? For home working, I'm going to come on briefly to talk about display screen equipment and mental health, because DSE is something that is particularly concerning during a lockdown situation. But where we are working from home, we can't forget our premises. Our employee duties probably matter less in relation to empty premises, but our duties to the public don't change. So are you still ensuring that your building is being checked and maintained? Loose slates, loose guttering, pieces of masonry that might fall off. None of that goes away in lockdown. We still have an obligation and a duty to members of the public to make sure that our premises don't present a risk. Equally, many places had to shut down at very short notice, and that's entirely understandable. But if you have premises which have dangerous equipment on them, dangerous chemicals, are they secure? Are locks still in place? Are fences properly maintained? I know from some work I do in the rail industry that at periods of time where the kids are off school, trespass increases. Kids want to get into locations, they're bored, they want to explore. Now that shouldn't be happening during lockdown, but I suspect it will be, and it increasingly will as we start to come out of lockdown. So do your premises present any risk to the public? And that's not just a risk of something happening as they walk by, but a risk that occurs because they can get in to your premises which are currently empty, and present risk to themselves. And I know from experience that that is something that the HSE will consider a prosecution for if you haven't done enough to prevent access. Even if it was a deliberate criminal act, the HSE will still look at a prosecution on the basis of having failed to do enough to dissuade people. So that's a particular risk when a number of us are sitting with empty premises and empty workplaces where very few people are going and checking on them. Are your policies and procedures home-proof? What I really want to mention there only very briefly is a lot of us will have forms that require to be filled in for safety checks, for safety processes. Our policies may well be in hard copy in the office. Do we all have intranets? Do we have means of all of our staff, whether they're working in the office, in the factory or at home, from accessing the right method statements, the right policies and procedures, and the right forms? Are they in electronic format? If they're not, I think the HSE will expect that after the immediate period of getting used to working from home, that these sort of things are put into electronic format and available. The main thing I want to cover reasonably briefly is display screen equipment. We're all sitting in front of laptops, iPads or iPhones this morning. I have no doubt there has been a huge increase in use of laptops and iPads for work purposes over the last month or so. I certainly know it's very different working from home on a laptop screen than it is to in the office with a docking station and a full screen. That presents a risk to people's health and safety, both in terms of their eyesight, but also in terms of the workstation they've got. Are they balancing on their lap? Are they at the kitchen table? Chances are they're not in a comfortable, purpose-designed office chair at a desk. The good news is we don't have to go and risk assess everybody's houses. We're not responsible if they fall down the stairs when they're going to make a cup of tea. But the HSE have made it very clear on their website that they expect employers to be conducting virtual workplace assessments. So we need to be going out to all of our staff and asking them and giving them a process to assess what their home working environment is like. Is there enough light? Does the desk adjust height? If it doesn't, and if they have particular requirements, they've got a history of back problems or they have a history of eyesight issues, we as employers have to be making reasonable adjustments for that. And that will include sending equipment to their houses, whether it be larger screens or allowing them to purchase a desk, if you can still get one anywhere, so that they can work from home properly. So make sure we're doing those virtual workplace assessments, keep meticulous records of what's been done and of any equipment supplied, so that in the event of a question from the HSE, you can demonstrate that you did all that was reasonably practicable during lockdown. I think in the minute or so I think I've got left of my 10-minute slots, I'd like to touch briefly on mental health. I know that Mark mentioned this. The general principle under health and safety law and civil liability for mental health conditions is that an employer is generally not liable for the first instance of a mental health problem, but will be liable for any subsequent instances if they haven't taken the necessary steps. It is a real risk of home working that people will develop stress or other mental health conditions associated with remoteness and isolation, and employers can't be expected to deal with those that arise. But if you have employees who are already perhaps on a restricted working arrangement because of mental health challenges or have had stress issues in the past, we as employers do have very clear duties to them during lockdown to make sure that those issues are addressed and that steps are taken to prevent it. Arguably the obligation increases during lockdown rather than goes away. So we need to think, as Mark talked about how to create a supportive environment. Are we making sure that our employees are aware of any counselling services that we have, employee consultation services? Is there a buddy system that has been created to make sure that everybody has somebody to talk to? But the one thing I think I want to flag up is that sometimes the best of intentions can actually create the problem. One of the very clear aspects of health and safety legislation is the entitlement to breaks from work, breaks during the working day. And as Mark has said, it's critically important that we allow our teams to make that distinction between work life and home life. And one of the things that I think all organisations have probably been guilty of over the last month is doing our very best and arguably doing too much to make sure that we all talk to each other and that our teams feel part of a collegiate environment and they don't feel isolated. But we're doing that quite often at 1 o'clock and at 5 o'clock. If an employee is sitting at their laptop thinking the only time I can get a break in my day is 1 o'clock, and then we put in a team meeting or a team Zoom call, or they have family commitments at 5 o'clock because they've got to look after the kids after homeschooling, and we put in a team call at 5 o'clock. Although that is very well intentioned, that is creating stress. It's taking away their entitlement to a break. So be very careful about the systems that we're putting in place to make sure our employees talk to each other. Make sure someone in the organization knows the total burden of these things. Is someone being asked to join 5, 6, 7 team meetings a week? And is that itself a source of stress? So don't let the very best of intentions inadvertently create a health and safety risk for the employees and a potential risk for a claim against the organization. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Very interesting. And again, sort of brings in the idea that we're going to be in lockdown for, well, we don't know how long we're going to be in lockdown for, but for however long we're in lockdown for, we're likely to be remote working for so much longer. And the interesting point Malcolm makes about HSE assessing things according to what is reasonably practicable, one can imagine that what is reasonably practicable will, of course, increase the longer that remote working continues. Now, if we can shift on now to Craig Kennedy, who's going to talk to us about the cyber threat and proactive resilience. Craig's a partner in our disputes team, splitting his time between Glasgow and Edinburgh. He heads up our civil fraud and cyber crime practice in Scotland and has a significant amount of experience of advising clients on the steps that they can proactively take to improve their cyber resilience. Craig's also an accredited counter fraud specialist and a member of the Cyber Crime Practitioners Association. He regularly acts for clients facing a wide range of business threats such as insolvency, fraud and cyber related issues. So Craig, if I can pass on to you please to talk us through these cyber issues.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Doug. So you might think that by this point in the session on the practical difficulties of working from home, we might have touched on how to minimise the amount of time employees spend watching Tiger King and maximise the time they spend on work-related tasks. I doubt even Carol Baskin would have the answer to that, but before we wrap up, I wanted to take some time to look at the way in which cyber criminals are currently exploiting the COVID crisis. Now, earlier this month, the UK and US issued a joint advisory notice warning of the ways in which cyber criminals are seeking to capitalise on the current COVID situation. And the clear message to all businesses is be prepared. Now, everyone's heard of cybercrime and if pushed could probably think of 1 or 2 ways in which it might affect their business. But there's often a lack of understanding of who perpetrates cyber attacks, the numerous ways in which it can infiltrate a business, particularly during a pandemic, and what the direct and indirect consequences of an attack actually are. So I'd like to use the rest of this session to outline who poses these threats, how they might find their way into your organisation, how they can affect your business, and what can be done to guard against them. So let's begin by looking at who generally presents these threats and what they might look like. New slide, please. So we can see from this slide that there are 5 main types of attacker. I'll run through each of them in turn. Hopefully we've all heard of social engineering. It involves hackers manipulating people to act in a way that's helpful to them. And phishing is the most common type of social engineering attack. And in the current climate, phishing emails are very likely to focus on coronavirus and the hope that the content of the email will encourage the recipient to click on links, which will redirect the recipient to a dark corner of the web where usernames, passwords, or payment details can be stolen. So while phishing typically sees threats blasted out into the ether, hoping that someone falls over them, spear phishing specifically targets an individual, which has proved to be a very successful method of compromising businesses. Now, this type of attack effectively tricks organisations into diverting payments into the hands of fraudsters, generally by impersonating a senior member of staff and instructing payment. Now, this is also known as CEO impersonation fraud or whaling. Now, these types of attack are particularly dangerous at present as finance teams across the country are now working remotely. It's no longer possible to simply shout across the desk to a colleague to check the provenance of payment instructions. And similarly, it's possible that emails or instant messaging will be used instead of calls to check payment instructions. So if a senior executive's emails are compromised, any checks made by finance teams would fail to work as they would in effect be corresponding with the fraudsters rather than their actual colleague. Now, we know that hackers are currently working hard to exploit known vulnerabilities in VPN software such as Citrix, which is facilitating everyone's working from home arrangements at present. And many teams are currently relying on what were, until lockdown, unfamiliar communication platforms like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, which require users to click on links or open attachments to access calls. And there's evidence that cyber attackers are seeking to take advantage of this lack of familiarity with those applications and weaponize bogus links to compromise systems. Now, it's likely that most organizations have staff using personal IT equipment at present to connect on to a VPN, and hackers are also trying to find ways to exploit the unusual variability of IT security across a variety of personal devices at the moment. Now, the rogue employee is the next category of cyber threat. It's often overlooked, and research tells us that 52% of all data breaches are caused by insider threat, human error, and system failures. And history tells us that when market conditions are bad, disaffected employees are more likely to take steps to harm their employers. Now, rogue employees could capitalise on a lack of supervision to act improperly in the hope that the current levels of disruption mask their actions, and this is something that we often see in times of crisis. Now, ransomware is something we're hopefully all have heard of. Instead of taking a physical hostage, and frankly, who could be bothered with that these days, the electronic systems are hijacked, encrypted, and ransoms are demanded, typically in bitcoins, for the release key. And in recent weeks, we've seen banking Trojan malware masquerading as an app developed by the World Health Organization, and various symptom trackers are also being used to install malware and ransomware threats on the devices used to facilitate remote working. Now, worryingly, over 4,000 COVID-19 domains have been registered since the start of the year, a significant number of which will be an attempt by cyber criminals to capitalise on the interest and fear generated by the topic to lure unsuspecting people to act in ways which would compromise their online security. New slide, please. So how can this affect your business? Well, this slide sets out the various heads of loss that a business could expect to face after a significant cyber incident. The incident response costs and remediation costs are often significant, and whilst it's often hard to calculate the cost of lost business or reputational damage, most businesses suffer those types of losses through cyber events. Now, it's now well known that any incidents which result in a loss of data could result in sanctions being imposed under GDPR, which carry a maximum penalty of 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover. But businesses could also face a raft of breach of contract claims if any cyber incident prevents a business from fulfilling any of the contractual obligations it owes to those it ordinarily transacts with. And businesses could also potentially face negligence proceedings at the hands of any party who suffered damage which could and should have been prevented. Now, until the beginning of this month, businesses could also be found vicariously liable for the malicious actions of its employees. However, earlier this month, the Supreme Court held that Morrison's supermarket should not be held liable for the malicious acts of one of its employees, which led to confidential details of thousands of Morrison's employees being leaked online. And while that represents a welcome restriction in liability for employers, they could still find themselves vicariously liable for the negligent act of their employees. Okay, new slide, please. So new slide. Thanks. So what can be done to mitigate the threat? Well, a sensible starting point would be to consider getting cyber insurance. Cyber insurance can cover many losses flowing from cybercrime, albeit sanctions are uninsurable, as are awards of damages made by the courts. So while cyber insurance can protect against many risks, it's not a replacement for good cyber hygiene. Now, insurance aside, the good news is that there's much that can be done proactively to guard against cyber risk. It's imperative that every business has an appropriate incident response plan in place. Having an effective incident response plan brings with it many benefits, including improved resilience against cyber attacks, a greater chance of achieving business continuity in the event of an attack, and a reduction in the financial impact of a cyber attack. Now, if your systems fail, you'll need to establish lines of communication via alternative means. So somewhat ironically, the current working from home arrangements provide the ideal environment for your response team to practice in. Now, businesses should also educate staff on the risks presented by cybercrime. Most ransomware attacks begin with a member of staff clicking on a link contained in an infected email. It's therefore important that staff are told not to click on links contained within suspicious or unexpected emails with a view to preserving the integrity of IT systems. And if an individual routinely fails mock testing, a business knows where the weak links are and can focus remedial training accordingly. Now, similarly, it's important that members of staff and a finance team are told of the various confidence tricks that could result in funds being unwittingly transferred to a fraudster's account. If members of staff know of the various cyber attacks, tricks and scams that are doing the rounds, they stand a much better chance of avoiding falling foul of them. Now, we've prepared cyber training materials which are available free of charge and will be released in the near future. So if that's of interest to you, please feel free to reach out after this session, and I'd be very happy to pick up with you individually regarding that. Now, given the speed with which working from home was thrust upon us, many businesses have not updated their policies and procedures to cater for the new normal of their entire workforce working remotely. Now, these policies and procedures should cover remote working access management, the use of personal devices, and minimum security standards, etc. And they should also prevent employees transferring documents or files out of a secure environment into a personal email environment, because it's very much easier for those documents to be compromised on personal email addresses. So once those policies are in place, businesses will be able to avoid the criticism that might otherwise attach to it following a cyber incident arising through a lack of corporate governance. Now, it's often said that there's never anything new in the world, and while COVID-19 might be the exception to that general rule, the good news is that from a cyber perspective, the COVID scams are simply a variation of the existing scams, which have been redesigned to appeal to what people find interesting at present. There's an inherent laziness amongst most criminals, cyber or otherwise, and even a few basic steps to improve cyber hygiene can be a significant step towards avoiding the most basic common threats. So I'd encourage every business to think about investing in cyber insurance, prepare an effective incident response plan, train staff on common cyber threats to avoid user error, and update policies to cater for the step shift to remote working. There's an old saying in the military, which is sweat more on the training ground, bleed less on the battlefield, which to my mind perfectly illustrates why businesses should be motivated to proactively improve its cyber resilience rather than waiting to do it in the aftermath of a cyber attack. So that concludes everything I wanted to cover. Doug, I think we could open for questions.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I think the point you make about none of these cyber threats really being new is a good one. It's just in the current environment within which we find ourselves, the risk of them being exploited, I think, is significantly greater. In particular, the sort of supplier impersonation issues, when you have rogue people impersonating some of your suppliers and giving you bank account details, and you unwittingly make payment to those bank account details and thinking you're paying your supplier, something which Craig has seen in the last couple of days. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that I would give you details of how to access our COVID-19 hub. There's a huge amount of information on there, but it is readily accessible, and it's organised by country and by subject area, and a lot of helpful stuff in there. So the details are there. If you can't scribble that down, simply Google Dentons COVID-19 hub, and you'll find it.